Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. The Magi here to talk about one of the questions I get the most, both from seasoned players and brand new players, and that is how to build budget decks without burning through all of your wildcards. So today we're going to try and take it from top to bottom. We're going to talk about resources, synergies to look for within your deck, how to construct that mana base, the balance within the deck between things like creatures and non-creatures, and how and when to upgrade a deck. But before we get into all that, thank you to all my new and prior followers on Twitch, helping us get one step closer to affiliate status. And one of those lucky followers picked up 2 starter decks for their Arena collection. My next big project here at the Stronghold is going to be to launch a Discord server featuring all sorts of chat channels about deck brewing, meta formats, helping you find a pairing for your own game, as well as channels to simply be social, find help, streaming, and special content. But to make this happen, I'm going to need the help of at least 10 people to step up and make a pledge of $1 or more per month over on Patreon. And hey, for only $1 a month, it's a lot of value, so make sure you're checking it out. And there's even a lot of content there that isn't released anywhere else, even for people who are not supporting on Patreon. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. So in my opinion, your very most budget decks are going to start with the resources you have. And that means, of course, your starter decks from any given year, what you've been able to gather from your jump-in events, as well as the individual cards and archetypes that you have drafted from the current set quick draft options. Now, these are so very important because these are resources you already have and you're already doing the work. It's not changing any behaviors or anything like that. It's not spending any additional money. It's not burning additional resources. Knowing which are your best starter decks, which are your best jump-ins, and which are your best draft archetypes is so very important, and that's why I spend my time every year and every season talking about these very subjects. You can find those videos right here on the channel. But once you have started developing these resources and getting things together, that is when you want to start building your budget decks. Now, of course, opening packs, whether you're getting those for free or you're buying them, those also add to your resources. And of course, take note that I'm not talking about spending wildcards here. Wildcards are not really meant for your budget decks until they have proven themselves, and we will talk about that more in a few minutes.
Let's talk about synergy. It's the concept that certain cards are more effective when played with certain other cards. The cards can function perfectly fine on their own, but because of synergy, they work better together than they ever would on their own. In other words, the cards feed upon each other and create more outcome than would otherwise be expected. This is such a crucial concept for new players to grasp, and also any sort of budget or free-to-play environment, because you really want to maximize the value of every card in your collection and every card that you play. And a synergy is by far the easiest pathway to doing that. It allows each card to give more impact to your win rate and your collection than it is really supposed to do. Now let's take a look at an example that we have talked about a lot so far this year. That is Conclave Mentor. As you can see, this card doubles its +1 counter, adds a +1 counter every time you would otherwise add a +1 counter. In many cases, effectively doubling the impact of the +1 counter. Cards like Sudden Strength and Invigorating Surge really feed into this environment and become much stronger in the presence of a Conclave Mentor. Something like Invigorating Surge, for instance, can really be game-breaking as an instant speed combat trick, forcing your opponent to make bad blocks and oftentimes winning the game as a result of an unblocked creature. Something that was never really intended in either of these cards. Now, on the opposite side of this very important coin, it's important not to overlook innately powerful cards just because they don't fit a synergy. For instance, our Procornus Unchained fits very nicely into this +1 counter synergy. On the other hand, our Gargoth does not. If you only had one slot available for either of these cards, the Unchained is clearly the better choice. But if you do have multiple slots, the overwhelming power of Gargoth should earn a slot in most decks if you have the space available for it. You really don't want to overlook an innately powerful card just because it may not fit a synergy. Now, because of this, you'll see a lot of different definitions about what makes a deck a synergy deck. And personally, I think any deck that half the cards or so don't feed in or benefit from the synergy, you're not really dealing with a synergy deck at that point. It doesn't necessarily make the deck bad, it's just not considered a synergistic deck. Personally, I shoot for 75% and up of the non-land cards when possible. But again, there are always going to be cards that, because of their innate power, should really be considered for inclusion, even if they don't fit your synergy.
And it doesn't really matter what your synergy is based around, whether that is something like a tribal effect. All you really got to do is just use the search bar there to search up your keyword, and that's going to show you every single card that even mentions that, and from there you just filter down by your color, your legal sets, etc., etc. And now that you've identified the synergy that you want to try and build around and have made a short list of the applicable cards that best fit that synergy, it's time to start putting those together into a deck. Now, of course, there are a number of benefits to staying to that 60 card minimum. And typically you're going to want somewhere in the 23-24 range for your land base. That leaves roughly 36 non-land cards. A good rule of thumb there is to have about 24 creatures and 12 non-creatures. And what you see on your screen here is an idea of a basic mana curve where you have one card slot for your 1 mana, you've got 2 or 3 for your 2s, etc., all the way up into your very high mana cost, 6, 7, or 8, where you want very few cards. And of course, this is going to shift around. If you were looking at running a mono red aggro, for instance, this is probably ideally going to be almost entirely 1 and 2 drops and then topping out at 3. Whereas if you're running a more mid-range control, the deck is probably going to be centered more around the 3 or 4 drop slots. And of course, we can't forget about that mana base. It can be very complicated, but that doesn't mean it has to be. My best advice is to start with 23 lands for a best of 1 deck, particularly in the play queue. Don't be afraid to run basic lands. You're going to hear a lot of content creators talk about the benefits of rare dual lands, and they aren't wrong, but it doesn't mean that your deck can't function on basic lands. And mostly you want to play what you have. The best advice I can give when it comes to wild cards and your mana base in particular is to play what you have. Build your deck first, find decks that interest you and show some promise, then improve the mana base over time. If you do it the other way around, a lot of times you end up spending wild cards for lands that you don't really like the deck for, or the meta shifts and the deck itself is not as good as you thought it was going to be. So avoid that pain and suffering and play what you have first and then build upon it. Once you've got your deck built, that's when you want to take it into the play queues. I recommend starting there, regardless of what your format of preference is. For a lot of you, that is going to be standard. And at that point, you just pick up one of your budget decks and run this through the gauntlet a few times. I wouldn't recommend judging it just on one day. Honestly, I tend to play my budget decks weeks at a time. Maybe not every single deck every single day, but according to your daily quests and things like that, certain decks are going to fit better than others. And I really don't recommend spending wildcard resources on decks until they've kind of proven themselves here in the play queue. I wouldn't spend wildcards on a deck that wasn't creating a 55% or better win rate over time. And if you're playing this deck a couple of hands every couple of days, really within a month or so, you're going to have 60, 70 matches to judge it by, potentially. And that is a big enough data sample to get an idea of whether the deck is any good or not, as well as is it something you can pilot competently, because some decks are easier than others, some decks are going to better fit your play style. And once you have an idea of whether a deck is good for you or not, that's when you want to start considering ways of making the deck better. Are there additional rares or mythics that you want to invest in the deck, or does it start to need some upgrades for the mana base? And before we go, I want to take just a moment to thank all of my patrons and remind the community when we hit just 10 patrons at any level, we will be rolling out Discord for the entire community, not just paid patrons. So if you have the means or mind to do so, consider supporting our community as it continues to grow. And of course, supporting the community by liking, commenting, subscribing, or sharing our videos is always appreciated. And you will appreciate subbing to the channel so you never miss out on a thing. And of course, we have some suggestions here on the next videos that you're going to want to check out.